Hey everyone, this is Alex from Mullen Memory, and in this video I wanted to talk about memorizing the facial nerve. So that's cranial nerve 7, an important nerve in anatomy, neuroanatomy, neurobiology, and I just wanted to talk about how I would use memory palaces to memorize this nerve, this schematic right here. And so, with this video, I don't necessarily want to go through and teach the entire nerve, and by the end of it, you'd know every little piece of this schematic, but I'd rather just kind of convey my general process for using memory palaces to memorize this. So based on, what I already know about the nerve, what I already know about neuroanatomy, and just kind of my general process for memorizing things like this. So let's go ahead and get started. Basically, I try to make my memory palace, say from a bird's eye view, looks somewhat like the schematic so that I can sort of connect the two very easily in my mind. So we can start here on the left, and we've got this little diagram of the brainstem here, midbrain up here, pons, medulla, spinal cord down here, and we have these four different nuclei, cranial nerve nuclei, that generate the different pieces of the nerve. So we can start there. So, I'm going to pick a palace to use for this schematic, and the first kind of palace that came to my mind was this chapel area at Ole Miss, and I'm from Oxford, Mississippi, where Ole Miss is, so I thought of that and I'm pretty familiar with that place. And it has a big bell tower, so this bell thing down here that we'll see a little bit later is an important part of the nerve, and so that kind of jumped to my mind very quickly, so I decided to use that area as my memory palace. And I didn't really pick the loci ahead of time. I just decided to use that area, and then I'm going to pick the loci and the images as I go, deciding what I want to remember about this specific schematic. And so that's kind of my general process. So over here we've got these four different nuclei. Let's start there. And I really try not to memorize everything. That's really not kind of the goal of this. I just want to use it to help me remember those little tricky things that are hard to remember. And so I'm only going to actually make images for two of these different nuclei, even though there are four of them. So, and I'll kind of explain that in a second. So let's start with superior salivatory nucleus. So that's kind of a good one to memorize because, there's superior and inferior salivatory nuclei. You might want to just remember that specific thing. And there's, there's a lot of nerves that sound, or nuclei that sound kind of similar. So let's make an image for that one. So I'm going to start in a locus that's on the left side of this sort of Perseates chapel bell tower area that I've chosen as my palace. And so I'm going to switch over to that place real quick so you can see that right here. So, this is the bell tower right here. And to the left, just like in the schematic, we're going to choose an image that represents superior salivatory right here. And so the image that I chose, just the first thing that came to my mind when I saw that was Salvador Dali, so the artist, with the kind of crazy mustache and things like that. So he's going to be my image for superior salivatory. I chose to put him on the top of the building just to remember the superior part. So I think, okay, Salvador Dali way up high on that building, that's superior salivatory nucleus. And that's generating, the GVE fibers as part of this facial nerve. So, on the top of the building over here, and hopefully this kind of makes sense if you can kind of see it in your head. This is a dorm little area that I'm used to. We'll have Salvador Dali kind of standing up on the roof of that building right there. So that's the first image. So, I said I was only going to memorize two of these. The facial motor nucleus, I'm not going to memorize that. It's very, very obvious. Facial motor nuclei controls the different motor components, these red fibers here of the facial nerve. So I'm not going to memorize that, not too important. Same thing with spinal trigeminal nucleus. I'm very familiar with spinal trigeminal nucleus doing the, sensory fibers, the GSAs here. So I decided to leave those out just to not overload the palace. The other one I do want to memorize is the rostral solitary nucleus. So, that is the SVAs, and that will do the taste sensation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So those fibers come all the way back here and synapse at the rostral solitary nucleus. Again, kind of hard to memorize because there's this distinction between rostral and caudal parts of the solitary nucleus. And so maybe we want to remember that thing specifically. So my image for rostral solitary nucleus will be a statue. So a statue is very solitary, just sort of standing there by himself. And I'm imagining this kind of knight for some reason, this statue of a knight, and he's just kind of sticking his nose way up high. And that kind of reminds you of rostral, because rostral is, kind of a nasal indication. So we have this knight, sticking his nose up high to remember rostral solitary nucleus. And I put that at the base of this dorm right here. So the statue here, we have Salvador Dali, superior salivatory nucleus. We have the nose pointing rostral solitary statue down here to remember that part of the nuclei. So that's it for the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem. So let's keep going forward here. So the nerve exits at the pontomedullary junction. I think that's correct. And comes out here and goes through this little hole in the skull in the temporal bone called the internal acoustic meatus. And so that's also kind of a little tricky to remember because it's internal versus external. There's different, holes that the different nerves go through. We want to remember internal acoustic meatus. And so the way I decided to remember that, if we go over to here, is just using a big pile of meat, and there's a little cafeteria. This building right here is a cafeteria, if you can kind of imagine that for yourself. And I'm just imagining this pile of meat inside the cafeteria. This big pile of raw meat, and I'm remembering that it's inside. So inside for internal, meat for meatus, so internal acoustic meatus. So, that's that part. The nerve continues going through up here, and eventually gets to this thing, this important ganglion, collection of cell bodies up here called the geniculate ganglion. And so going back, I decided, to make an image for this also, because that's kind of an important one to remember. And geniculate makes me think of someone genuflecting. So you're familiar with, like a Catholic mass service, you genuflect a lot, and you kneel down on your knees. And so I imagine someone doing that over here. So there's this quad area right here, and there's this big fountain in the middle. And right here, like I said, on a bird's eye view, kind of similar to this diagram right here, we're going to have a person, doesn't really matter who it is, I just kind of imagining this pious sort of religious person genuflecting, kneeling in front of the statue for the geniculate ganglion. And so we have this little branch, of the nerve that splits off right before you get to the geniculate ganglion, and that's the greater petrosal nerve. And so that's also one that's kind of tricky to remember because there's different pieces to the petrosal nerve. Somewhere else there's a deep petrosal nerve, here there's the greater petrosal nerve, and so I wanted to remember that thing specifically. And so for greater petrosal nerve, I decided to use Muhammad Ali. So he's the greatest, right? So that helps me remember the greater part. And then petrosal kind of sounds like, Petro or rock, going back to Latin or Greek or something. So what I decided to do was there's this little pathway up here right in front of the library. So this is the Ole Miss library. And so I'm just imagining Muhammad Ali kind of running along this path. And it's not too hard to imagine that, the path under him is made of stone. So Ali for greater, and then stone for petrosal. So we have the greater petrosal nerve kind of branching off before the geniculate ganglion up here. And so what does that nerve do? Well, it goes up and it synapses on the pterygopalatine ganglion, and then and that's really part of V2, which is the branch of the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. And so that's kind of a separate nerve, but we're including it here because it's an important component of the facial nerve. So pterygopalatine ganglion up here, and what that does is after the synapse, it goes on and runs along another branch, the zygomatic temporal branch, I think, and then it eventually goes and innervates the lacrimal gland and produces tears. So that's kind of an important thing to know. The facial nerve is responsible for generating tear production in the lacrimal gland. So let's do those couple of things here. So pterygopalatine ganglion. And we're going to imagine just right on the top in this area, right on the top of the library, there's this big pterodactyl. So again, just first thing I thought of, you make an image quickly. You don't have to think about it too long. Pterodactyl for pterygopalatine ganglion. And we're just going to imagine that he's sort of tearing up, and these pterodactyl tears are falling down onto the people who are going into the library. So we've got, Muhammad Ali running along the stone path, greater petrosal nerve. We got this pterodactyl, pterygopalatine ganglion, and that's going up and innervating the lacrimal gland to produce tears. Okay, so we've done, all this little part up here now, and let's, run down here. So the geniculate ganglion takes a bend in the temporal bone. That's really why it's called the geniculate ganglion, because it has this, this bend, and it goes through the middle ear. And so the middle ear, I just kind of decided to think about this fountain here as sort of representing the middle ear, just because it kind of has that cylindrical sort of shape to it, middle ear. And so it has this one little piece that's worthwhile, that's worth knowing, that pops up off here. So that's SVE, these red fibers here. And that is the nerve to the stapedius muscle. And so what that does is it innervates the stapedius and keeps that stapes, part of those ossicles, pressed against the tympanic membrane, and that kind of prevents you from having ear issues. And so, we want to remember that little piece inside the middle ear that goes off and innervates the stapedius. And so for that, stapedius sort of sounded to me like stampede. So I just imagine on this little part of the fountain here that there's this stampede of animals, it could be wildebeests or whatever, just running along that fountain, to remember that little piece, that nerve to stapedius. So moving down here, so it continues through the middle ear, and it's kind of interesting, that the facial nerve runs through the ear canal, and it comes out here. And for these little things, it first goes through this little foramen called the stylomastoid foramen. So stylomastoid foramen, and an important thing to know about this is that if you've ever heard of Bell's palsy, where people will get this facial droop, I actually had it myself when I was a kid. Basically, it comes about because of an injury right at the stylomastoid foramen here, and so all of these muscles here that are controlling facial motor are compromised, and so you kind of get this facial droop on one side. And so let's go with that. So there's this bell tower here, like I said, right there, this bell tower. And so that's not hard to remember, the Bell's palsy part. And just to, make sure you remember the stylomastoid foramen, I just imagine sort of at the top of that bell tower, there's a big mast, like on a ship with this, big sails. And the central part of the mast is a stylus. I just kind of remember that. So stylus with the mast, so stylomastoid foramen, and the bell for Bell's palsy. So going back here, and you have all these different little branches that are kind of hard to remember coming off here that do a lot of important facial motor things like that. And so here, let's just start with this little bit of ear here. So this is a GSA. It's just a general, like touch, sensory sensation. It's sort of the back of the ear. There's this little piece, behind the ear where you get sensation via the facial nerve, which is kind of interesting. And so what I'm going to do for this stuff here, this little chunk of 3, is put it inside the chapel. So the chapel is right here, and there's this little bit behind the ear, and so I'm just going to imagine an ear stuck right up against the organ. So there's an organ up here, and it's playing really loud, and just all that music is just blasting right into the large ear that I've placed there. So that's that one, and then there's also these 2 SVE fibers coming down here. Posterior belly of the digastric. Honestly, I have no idea what that does, but we're going to memorize it for the purposes of this video. And then the posterior auricular nerve, which is kind of interesting because that's what controls your ear movement. So when you kind of move your ears like this, that's what's actually doing it. So let's just take those together since they're both SVE fibers. And so what I'm going to do is in the first pew of the church right here, where it says Aunt Belly right there, I'm going to imagine one of my aunts. And so the reason I thought of that is because I always remember her wiggling her ears. She was kind of one of the first people who showed me how to wiggle my ears and did it. So I thought of her. So I'm going to imagine her sitting there in this first pew. And for posterior belly of the digastric, I'm just going to imagine that she has a belly coming out of her back. Okay, so kind of a weird image, but she's sitting in this pew and she's got this belly coming out of her back for posterior belly of the digastric. So those are that chunk of 3. And then over here we have a very important set of branches of the nerve that basically control all of your facial motor functions. Moving your face, moving your your forehead, your cheeks, your mouth, all that kind of stuff is controlled by these different branches. And I'm not going to go into which branch does exactly which things, because usually you don't really need to know that as a med student. But we'll go through those branches real quick. It does go through, pretty importantly, the parotid gland. So this branch of the facial nerve runs through the parotid. And, I was already pretty familiar with that. So, why memorize it, right? With the palace. So I already know that. So it goes through, and it goes through these different branches, which are kind of hard to remember. And the easy way that I chose to remember this is just this mnemonic that I picked up from one of my gross anatomy teachers. And that is a little phrase, and it's to Zanzibar by motor car. So TZBMC, to Zanzibar by motor car. And so that gives you temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical. And mandibular is one that you might confuse with maxillary. And so for that, I just try to remember that, okay, there's a man in this car for mandibular. And so, that image, there's a little parking lot right here, very conveniently. And so I just stuck this kind of old-fashioned motor car there to remember that little mnemonic, to Zanzibar by motor car. And so that gives me those different branches right there. Okay, so we've kind of covered this little chunk here. We've covered all of the, facial motor functions, all the stuff that the facial motor nucleus does right over here. And let's just tackle this last little chunk here. We're almost done, going down through here. And so, before it hits the stylomastoid foramen, it branches off to the left and does this kind of loop here, going through the, not sure where it goes through here, but not important for now. And so it goes through here and goes through this place called this petrotympanic fissure. Okay, so that's, something that might be worth remembering, petrotympanic fissure, where before it pops out and does some stuff kind of in the oral area. So petrotympanic fissure, just kind of preserving the spatial structure of the palate. I'm going to have an image for petrotympanic fissure down here on the street below. And so petrotympanic fissure, petro, again, I'm just going to use a big stone, not a stone pathway this time, but just a stone, and it's going to be smashing down, a large stone smashing down onto a tympany. Maybe the tympany was just carried right out of the church onto the street here. So a stone smashing down on a tympany for petrotympanic fissure. And this entire branch of the facial nerve is called the chorda tympani. And so, we already have this tympany outside, petrotympanic fissure. Not too hard to remember that this is the chorda tympani branch of the nerve. And that will, synapse on the submandibular ganglion and go out here and do two quick things. It'll innervate some of the salivary glands. And, remember we have the superior salivatory nucleus, so not too hard to remember that you're going to get salivatory innervation down here. And we have this other branch, which is SVA, doing the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And that's giving you taste to the front of your tongue. So that's obviously very important. And so, submandibular ganglion, already pretty familiar with that. Didn't want to make an image for it. And, I was already pretty familiar with the term sublingual, submandibular glands doing salivary to the oral area. And so let's just make some images for that really quick. So anterior 2/3 of the tongue and saliva, just to remember that. So going back to the palate here, there's this little intersection right here. And so I'm just going to imagine a large tongue kind of sweeping through the intersection, getting saliva, dripping saliva all over this little intersection. So that's pretty much it. Kind of ignoring the submandibular ganglion, sublingual, submandibular glands. It's not too hard to remember. So let's not make images for it. So that really, covers pretty much everything, for this nerve here. That's how I would do it. So I leave out things, I put in what I want to remember. And to me, that pretty easily captures pretty much all of this nerve here. And so hopefully, that makes sense and kind of gives you a sense of how I would actually use a memory palace to memorize this nerve. Let's just see if I can go through real quick and kind of list it off for you to have it make sense. So, starting on the left side of the schematic, hopefully the palace kind of matches the schematic pretty well. We've got Salvador Dali up on the top of the roof. He's the superior salivatory ganglion doing the GVE fibers. And we've got a couple of other ones that I didn't memorize. So that's facial motor nucleus and spinal trigeminal, doing the motor and the sensory parts of the nerve, or the general parts of those. And then we've got the rostral solitary nucleus. That's our statue at the bottom of that dorm area right there. That's doing the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, also called the gustatory nucleus, not surprisingly. So those are the nuclei. We've got it coming off at the ponomedular junction, going through the internal acoustic meatus with the meat inside of the cafeteria area. It's going to swing up through the temporal bone and eventually arrive at the geniculate ganglion. So that's the our genuflecting pious person right there. We've got a branch called the greater petrosal nerve. That's our Muhammad Ali, running up and then synapsing on the pterygopalatine ganglion. That's the pterodactyl right there. That ends up becoming part of V2 of the trigeminal nerve and doing the lacrimal gland, your tear production. So that pterodactyl is tearing up. And so going down, going back to that genu from the geniculate ganglion, it goes through the middle ear. There's a little branch that pops out and does the innervation to the stapedius muscle. So we've got a little stampede running around that fountain right there. And then it goes down, goes through the middle ear, eventually comes out of the stylomastoid foramen. So we have a stylus with a mast, and that's, that injury at that site is what gives you the Bell's palsy. And so you can pretty easily figure out, what kind of presentation you would get with Bell's palsy there. So a couple of branches, a little chunk of 3 coming off that do sensory GSA to the back of the ear, that also do, posterior auricular nerve to wiggle your ears, and posterior belly of the digastric. No idea what that does. It comes out and also has a bunch of branches, 5 branches to Zanzibar bimotor car to do the temporal, temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical branches of the facial nerve. Those do different muscular things to the face. And then before we got to the stylomastoid foramen, we had a little branch that ran around, and that's the chorda tympani, eventually exits the skull through the petrotympanic fissure. That was our rock, our stone, crashing onto the tympani. Eventually synapses on the submandibular ganglion, and goes out and does salivation to sublingual, submandibular salivary glands, and innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue for taste, part of the SVA system. So hopefully, just kind of running through that, that's kind of just what I'm seeing in my head there, and that kind of matches with the schematic here pretty well. And so, what I would do to continue remembering this nerve is to review it periodically using spaced repetition, specifically using the spaced repetition software Anki. So I've talked a lot about that on different parts of the website, and just I made a couple of Anki cards here to kind of help me remember these different things. So facial nerve, the different nerve types, GSA, SVA, whatever, asking about that, and then asking about general functions, because those connect pretty well. So, that's going to be, you connect those with the cranial nerve nuclei pretty well. So, let's say spinal trigeminal nucleus, that's GSA. So you're going to have GSA, facial motor nucleus, that's SVE. And that does facial motor, functions to the face, and also the wiggling your ears, that kind of stuff. You're going to have the other 2 nuclei that we memorized on that dorm building, superior salivatory, that's GVEs. So that's going to do, obviously, the salivation, think of the tongue, and then the tearing, so the pterodactyl. So that's that one. And then the last one we're missing, facial motor, spinal trigeminal, superior salivatory, and rostral solitary, that does the taste. So, GSA, SVE, GVE, and SVA. So we've kind of gone through those there. Pretty simple. And then this is just kind of how I make the cards, front, back, and then the diagram here. And then I've kind of written out the mnemonic the way that I would actually do it. So I wouldn't necessarily include I don't normally draw my palaces out. So that drawing that I made here, I don't normally do this. I just kind of write it out quickly because it's faster that way. And so this is what that would actually look like right here. So a couple more cards. I won't go through and bore you too much with the details. But tracing the facial nerve, that's just kind of running through it in my head. And then Bell's palsy location, if you remember, stylomastoid foramen. So those are the cards that I made for that. So again, hopefully that kind of gives you a good sense of some anatomy, and how I would use Memory Palace to memorize the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7. So thank you.